Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone. I want to present a paper called Verifiable, Secure, and Proportional Committee Election Rule. This is a joint work with my colleague Alistair Stewart and myself. I'm a research scientist at Web3 Foundation in Switzerland. So for full disclosure, we are laying the foundations of the and the core protocols of Polkadot, in case that's not clear. Okay, so I found this paper a little difficult to motivate because it's a multidisciplinary. It touches several components like election theory, blockchain networks, in particular the architecture of the decentralized blockchain network, and also optimization. And I would say traditionally the audiences of these different topics are they don't coincide much. So I will spend most of my talk, or actually probably all of my talk, actually giving the background and the motivation of our work and explaining our results, and probably not so much about giving the proof, explaining the actual proofs. So I will leave the proofs actually for questions if there are any. Okay, so there are four, let's say, 5 parts of the talk. First, I will talk about election theory and the notion of proportional representation. Then how the architecture of blockchain network works, and why we need to think about proportional representation for the particular problem of validator selection, which is our motivating problem. Then I will finally present the contributions and some conclusions. Okay, so let's start with proportional representation. So the image that is in the background, it's probably not very clear, but it's actually a book published by Edward Fragment. That was a mathematician and the book was published in 1895, so over 120 years ago. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about voting theory. I want to talk about approval-based committee elections. These are it's the nice thing about these theories that it's very simple to define, and yet there's a wealth of results that are some of them very complicated. So I want to think about a scenario where there's a finite set of voters and a finite set of candidates, and we need to elect K of the candidates to form some committee. Every voter gets to either approve or disapprove of every candidate. So there's no limit on approvals, on number of approvals. There is no ranking, there is no scoring, and also there's not necessarily a notion of political parties. So we can think that every voter can freely choose the candidates that he or she trusts. And then there's going to be some election rule that is automatically going to elect out of the input of the voters' ballots K winning candidates. And we're also going to assume a scenario where the votes are weighted. So I'm going to follow the logic that a voter with 2 units of vote is proportional. Let's say it's equivalent to 2 voters with a single unit of vote and equal preferences. So how would we define an election rule? So for that, we need to think about what are the criteria or the goals that we actually want to achieve. So here's some example. We have voters on the left, and the voters have voting power. So the first voter has a voting power of 10, we have 18, 4, 5, 3, and on the right we have candidates. And let's say we want to elect 4 out of 5 candidates. So in this particular case, the question would be, which 4 out of 5 do we actually elect? What's the most fair way to do it? And here we have a notion that since candidate A has a lot of backing, we probably should elect A, but candidate E doesn't have a lot of backing, so probably E could be one candidate that's not elected. So let's try to formalize this. So there is this notion of proportional representation that has actually been around for over a century. And the idea is that it ensures that minorities in the electorate are not underrepresented. And when I say minority here, I mean any group of voters that have certain preferences in common. So they form, we could think that they form a political party, but this is really, really loosely defined. So there's going to be some kind of threshold on when we consider that any group of voters are cohesive enough in terms of preferences, and then a threshold of when we consider that that political party is underrepresented or overrepresented. So in this particular case, we're only worrying about avoiding underrepresentation, and this has been widely used because it's assumed that it ensures satisfaction and engagement of minorities, and it has been studied by theoreticians in voting theory for over a century, and in particular, we have mathematicians F.R. Fragment and Thorvald Field that worry about proportional representation, and we can think of them basically as forefathers of the whole voting theory. And they have been also widely used for elections of state parliaments in countries, faculty councils in universities, and boards of trustees in companies. So yeah, there's even though the intuition is pretty simple, there's a wealth of research, and there are many ways to formalize the problem, and then you have to ask questions about feasibility and complexity. For instance, recently there have been these attempts to formalize proportional representation. So basically, justified representation is a basic binary notion that says whether or not a minority has a justified right to have a representative. Then I don't want to go into definitions. Maybe I can give them at the end. Then we have extended justified representation that is actually has this sense of proportionality that the bigger a minority is, the more representative it should have. And in particular, it cares about the fairness with respect to voter satisfaction. And we have proportional justified representation that cares, is also proportional and cares about fairness with respect to the voter's decision power. It will turn out that we actually care about PJR in this paper, proportional justified representation, but I will say more about that later. And I wanted to mention that, for instance, proportional approval voting, which is a classical voting rule by Thiel, satisfies PJR and EJR, but it's not hard to compute, while some efficient heuristics fail. And we also have that. So yeah, coming up with polynomial time rules that achieve either EJR or PJR, which are like the more sophisticated ones, has been an ongoing problem, and only in the last 5 years there have actually been proposed polynomial time rules. So something that we do different in this paper is that we want to consider the problem of preventing overrepresentation, and we consider it as a matter of security. So we actually consider an adversarial model where an adversary might want to attempt to gain control of a certain number of committee seats, like more committee seats that it should be due, to actually sabotage the governance body. And we will think about an application to blockchain consensus protocols. So in this example, for instance, we have K+1 voters. So the first K voters they're not very good at agreeing on their selection of candidates, but the last candidate, the last voter has a separate K set of candidates that he likes, and we think that there's actually an adversary that controls this last voter and these last K candidates, and we can actually test the different election rules against this example. And it turns out that most of the election rules would be perfectly happy to select K half. So let's say K is equal to 4, they would be happy to select these top two candidates from the first half of candidates and the bottom, and these two candidates from the bottom half, because they actually give two representatives to each candidate, to each voter. So every voter has at least two favorite candidates, actually gets the candidate. So it's perfectly good in terms of satisfaction, but it's bad in terms of avoiding overrepresentation, because we have this single voter that has a unit of vote out of k+1, so it should be getting one candidate as a representative, but it actually gets two. And it turns out that most of the election rules that are out there is going to heavily overrepresent this voter. Okay, so now what we do in the paper is define a new optimization objective that has security as the most important objective. And as I said before, we show that all election rules in literature are either too slow or they perform poorly in terms of security. Then we propose a new rule called FragMMS. This is because we are honoring Edward Fragment. And it provides, at the same time, guarantees in terms of security and also traditional proportional representation, in particular PGR, which is one of the more sophisticated criteria. And one of the key properties also is that it's very fast. It's actually fast enough to be implementable in the blockchain architecture. So I will talk about more about blockchain architecture. So I probably don't need to introduce this in this conference. We all know that a decentralized blockchain network is great. So there's no central authority. It provides the capacity to remove intermediaries for peer-to-peer value transfers. It has tons of applications, but it also has some disadvantages because the key to resilience is redundancy. So the correct execution is guaranteed as long as an honest supermajority of as we have an honest supermajority validators. But this actually imposes a hard computational limitation, because basically whatever computation we do is going to be it has to be repeated by all validators. So network is just as slow as the slowest validator. So actually implementing sophisticated election rules, or actually any election rule, is an open challenge on a blockchain. So only the most efficient algorithms allow direct implementations. So some possible solutions could be for scaling, could be sharding or layer 2 solutions. But what we actually propose is verifiable computing. So the idea of verifiable computing is that as opposed to other transactions or other tasks, so a task traditionally has to be performed by all validators, and they all have to finish before we can continue. But in a delegated computation, we're actually going to have an off-chain worker, or we can call him a prover, someone that is working completely separate from the logic of the rest of the network. And it's going to do a heavy computation. It's just going to return the output of the task, and it's only going to give the only the verification is going to fall on validators. So,
sorry, Alfonso. You only have like probably less than 4 minutes. Probably you need to speed up a little bit.
Okay, thanks. So verifiable computing makes sense as long as the task admits a verification test on its output, such that it guarantees correctness, even when the off-chain worker that actually computed the thing is not trusted, and it executes fast, in particular faster than performing the whole task from scratch, and admits parallelism. So admitting parallelism means that we actually can execute. We can split the verification test into multiple computing units, such as several blocks in the blockchain. And that's what we're actually going to do to implement an election rule. So we're going to run the election rule off-chain and then provide a solution on-chain. And then just verify the guarantees on security and proportionality on-chain over multiple blocks. And by doing that, we achieve scalability. So I can probably finish with this slide. So we propose a new rule called FragMMS that admits a verification test that guarantees proportional justified representation, which, as I said, is one of the more sophisticated notions of proportional representation, and our notion of security, which I think I won't have time to define. But as I said, it looks at the problem on the other way. Instead of caring about avoiding underrepresentation, we also care about avoiding overrepresentation. And we actually achieve guarantees on both sides for the first time. And this verification test runs in time linear in the size of the voters' ballots. And this is the first time that we achieve that there is an election rule that achieves such guarantees and that is so fast. And moreover, it can run over multiple computing units, each in time linear in the number of candidates and completely independent on the number of voters. So this provides even more scalability, because it means that we can just keep increasing and increasing the number of voters as long as the number of candidates doesn't increase. So yeah, there will be no problem in scaling.
1 minute, probably you consider a wrap up.
Yeah, so Polkadot is developing an implementation of this election rule for its validator selection protocol. So in order to select once per era, which is once per day, the set of validators that's going to run the that is going to run the consensus protocol for that day. And maybe as a conclusion, I can just say this is the first time that the problem of validator selection protocol has been analyzed formally in terms of computational social choice, even though we have a multitude of blockchain protocols that actually require validator selection protocols. Yeah, I will conclude here.
Yeah, thanks, Alfonso. Very interesting problem, actually. Yeah, for the audience, if you have any question, we probably have time for one quick question. Just post in the chat. While the audience get ready, I have a very quick one. So that you didn't mention like the network model. That does the synchronous model, partially synchronous model influence your protocol?
So not really. What we do is as I said, we take we perform an election once per era, which is more or less once per day. And towards the end of the day, so let's maybe like a couple of hours before the end of the day, we take a snapshot of the current preferences of validators, so of the current set of voters and candidates and preferences, and then we work with that. So usually the preferences don't change much from one day to the other. So whether we take a snapshot now or like 5 minutes later, it doesn't have a big impact. So I would say that from that point of view, yeah, high synchronicity is not very important.
Okay. If there's no more question from the audience, I guess that probably concludes the first session. And let's give a virtual applause to all the speakers of the first session.